Good morning, everybody. I know people are still joining, but we'll try to start on time. Welcome to this Environment Agency and Green Alliance event, Nurturing Nature, Can COP15 Stop a Silent Spring? My name's Sean Spears, I'm Director of Green Alliance. When I first joined Green Alliance as a member 15 or so years ago, my perception was very much that Green Alliance's focus was on climate change rather than on the natural world. But about 10 years ago, the organisation, before I joined as a staff member, the organisation took the decision to start a programme of work on the natural world, on the crisis of nature. And I think since then we've been clear that the climate crisis and the nature crisis are intimately linked, and you can't solve one without the other. So among the other areas of work we are engaged in, we are working on natural infrastructure schemes and natural climate solutions. We have a program of work on land use to try to come up with solutions that can deliver within the UK the food, nature and carbon that we need in our limited land area without exporting our environmental footprint. And we're working on greenhouse gas removals and promoting an office for carbon removal to try to bring some order to the wild west of carbon offsetting. So James Bevan, who is going to speak in a moment, the Chief Executive of the Environment Agency, James's focus on the natural world and the relationship between the natural world and climate change is extremely welcome. So we're going to hear from James, who has been Chief Executive of the Environment Agency since 2015, following a distinguished career in the Foreign Office. And then we're going to have comments from three speakers. I'm just trying to get the order in which they are speaking. First, Georgina Chandler, who is a Senior International Policy Officer for the RSPB and has been working on followed closely the negotiations of the Convention of Biological Diversity for the last 5 years, for which she almost certainly deserves a medal. Then we've got Guy Singh Watson, the founder of Riverford Organics, who is now an organic farmer in Devon. And then Daisy Hesenberger from the World Council for Sustainable Development, who is an associate for their Natural Climate Solutions Alliance. We're going to ask you to put your questions in the Q&A. You're welcome to chat among yourselves in the chat function, but if you could put questions in the Q&A function, then my colleague Sarah Williams, who heads the Green UK Alliance at Coalition at Green Alliance, Sarah will go through the questions, and with about 20 minutes to go, we will come to your questions. The last thing to say is to feel free to tweet if you are a tweeter at #GA event, and we'll hopefully get a debate going through Twitter as well. But without further ado, it's a great pleasure to welcome James to speak to you now. James.
Well, thanks, Sean, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to start with a quotation. There was once a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. Then a strange blight crept over the area. Everywhere was a shadow of death. It was a spring without voices. On the mornings that had once throbbed with the dawn chorus of robins, doves, jays, wrens, and scores of other bird voices, there was now no sound. Only silence lay over the fields and woods and marsh. No witchcraft, no enemy action had silenced the rebirth of new life in this stricken world. The people had done it themselves. Now, many of you will recognise those lines. They are the opening lines of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the book she wrote in 1962 that arguably started the modern environment movement. 60 years on, we're closer than ever to that silent spring. And since we humans and everything we cherish depend on nature, we have the strongest possible interest in avoiding that outcome. But if we're going to fix the problem, we need to start by understanding what the problem is. We need to know its magnitude, and we need to know what's causing it. And that's why, as Sean said, today, the Environment Agency has just published a major new report on the state of our nature. It looks in particular at what's happening to our plants and animals. Trigger warning, it's shocking. It explains what these do for us, apart from bringing us joy and beauty, and it sets out how we can turn things around. Now, the report we've written focuses on England, but you could write this report about almost any other country in the world right now. And while the details would all be different, the underlying picture would be the same: awful. Now, people have affected the environment in England for millennia, but it wasn't until the second half of the 20th century that things really started to go downhill. And our report collects some of the evidence. So since 1930, we have lost most of our meadows and species-rich grasslands, down by about 97%. Lowland heathlands cover only 20% of the area they did in the 19th century. There's been severe loss of our wetlands, which are one of the richest habitats of all. We have lost almost all of our fens, 99.7%, most, 81% of our grazing marshes, and nearly half, 44% of our lowland bogs. Most of our ancient trees have gone, and up to 70% of our remaining ancient woodlands have been deforested or damaged, mostly during the past century. And the decline in those precious habitats has had the inevitable consequence, which is an equally shocking decline in the plants and animals that depend on them. So since 1970, 41% of our species have decreased in abundance, and 15% of all our native species in Britain are now threatened with extinction. Again, let me just give you some figures. Since 1970, butterflies in this country have decreased in abundance by about 16%, moths by 25%, farmland birds by 55%. It's no better for our mammals. Since 1995, which is not that long ago, hedgehog numbers have dropped by about 2/3, and water voles have done even worse, a 78% drop since then in their numbers. Overall, 1/4 of mammals in England are now threatened with extinction. And let me just say that sentence again, in case you missed it. 1/4 of mammals in this country are now threatened with extinction. And if that doesn't make you angry, then you haven't been paying attention. Why is this happening? Well, it's the result of a combination of factors: unsustainable exploitation of our resources, changes in land use, pollution, modifications to our rivers, and urban development, much of which has been going on for centuries, but which is now having a cumulative effect. But what's making it even worse is something relatively new: the climate emergency. We're seeing changing climate patterns impacting habitats, and the warmer temperatures are now threatening the existence of some of our species. So there's a range of factors in the nature crisis we're now witnessing. They all, however, have one thing in common: they are all down to us, the humans. Now, you could say, does this matter? Does it really matter if the vole goes the way of the dodo? Well, yes, it does matter. It matters immensely, because the biodiversity crisis, and let's be clear, that's what it is, it won't just kill the plants and the animals it's killing, it will kill us as well. That's because nature provides us with a host of things that we depend on, like clean water, clean air, and food. No nature, no us. Now, the good news amidst all that bad is that we can turn this around. Here's how. The first part of the solution has to start at the global level, because what happens in one part of our planet affects all the other parts. The framework for that already exists: the International Convention on Biological Diversity. That commits all of its signatories, including the UK, to protect and enhance nature. And at Montreal this December, at the UN Biodiversity Conference, COP15 for the cognoscenti, we really need governments from around the world to come together to agree a new set of goals for the next decade that will halt and reverse this nature loss. And we need them to establish strong monitoring and effective follow-up so that we can see and measure progress on the ground. We also need action at the national level. The UK government's made a commitment to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, or in other words, to make this country nature positive. That sounds ambitious, but we could achieve it. We know what we need to do. We need to nurture our protected species. We need to sustain our protected areas. We need to better protect the wildlife habitats outside those areas. We need to restore our damaged habitats. We need to create new habitats. We need to start to knit together nature networks across the whole country. We need to build a nature positive approach into all of our planning and development. We need to stop the pollution that is damaging nature. We need to tackle the climate emergency. And wherever we have a problem, we need to use nature-based solutions as the default to solving it. And much of this not only can be done by governments, by businesses, by landowners, by others, much of it is already being done. We in the Environment Agency are playing our part. We protect species and the habitats on which they depend. Example, the work we do to ensure that the abstraction of water, which we regulate, doesn't damage wildlife or habitat. And when we think it will, we are reducing, or in some cases, stopping completely that abstraction. We create and restore habitat. We did that for over 1,000 hectares last year. We use our role as a statutory planning consultee to ensure that new developments don't damage the environment. We're tackling the pollution that hits our wildlife, including by reducing the amount of air pollution from the industries we regulate. We're improving our waters, on which so much of that nature and biodiversity depends. We enhanced over 1,500 kilometres of rivers and streams last year. We're tackling the climate crisis by regulating down most of the emissions that cause it and by helping communities adapt to its effects. And we are increasingly using nature-based solutions as our default, including in the new flood defence schemes that we are building. But none of us is as good as all of us, and we are all contributing in some way to the biodiversity crisis. And that means that every single one of us has a role to play in tackling it. And there are simple steps that we can all take in our everyday lives, all of which will also help tackle the linked climate crisis as well. So don't drive, walk, cycle, or take public transport. Have less stuff and reuse or recycle what you have. Use water wisely, particularly obviously now. If you have a garden, don't concrete over it, keep it green, put in a pool. Only eat sustainably sourced food. Make sure your pension isn't invested in businesses that are trashing the planet. Think about how your footfall resonates on this earth. Now, I started with a silent spring in which no birds sang. That is the future that we will have if we fail to act. But there is another much brighter future that we can have if we do choose to act. And that's a future, I think, encapsulated very well in another work of literature, a poem, which is also kind of nostalgic. It's called Adelstrop by Edward Thomas. He wrote it in 1917 towards the end of a war that tragically he himself did not survive. And it goes like this. Yes, I remember Adelstrop, the name, because one afternoon of heat, the express train drew up there unwantedly. It was late June. The steam hissed. Someone cleared his throat. No one left and no one came on the bare platform. What I saw was Adelstrop, only the name, and willows, willow herb and grass and meadowsweet and haycocks dry, no whit less still and lonely fair than the high cloudlets in the sky. And for that minute, a blackbird sang close by, and round him, mistier, farther and farther, all the birds of Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire. So let's refuse the silent spring. Let's keep Adelstrop in our hearts, and let's tackle the nature crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. No nature, no us is clearly a very powerful message, and I've heard you say that you would leap out of bed every morning to get the planet to be nature positive. Do you see our politicians showing similar enthusiasm? Just kind of pick a random 11, the candidates for the current Conservative Party leadership.
Well, Sean, I like my job, and I would very much like to carry on doing it. I will say, in the kind of 40 years that I've been involved with government, I've seen a steady rise in the salience of climate and the environment, and that, you know, give her due, that started actually with Margaret Thatcher, who was one of the first world leaders to clock the issues of climate change. And, whatever you think of politicians, either in this country or around the world, they all have one thing in common, which is they pay a lot of attention to the voters. And the voters, in particular, the rising generation of voters in this country and around the world, they really, really care. They really care about climate. They care about the biodiversity crisis. They care about green issues. And the politicians will ultimately, I think, follow the lead of the electorates. So I'm upbeat about the prospects.
Oh God, I keep turning myself. There we are. Sorry about that. Yeah. So thank you, James. So Georgina, turning to you, James said the solution has to start at the global level, and clearly the UK government, and I think particularly Zach Goldsmith, has shown a lot of leadership in pushing the importance of COP15. Are they doing enough? Are we showing enough leadership at home to make a real difference at COP15? Georgina, do you want to comment?
Thank you, Sean. Yes, for those of you that aren't aware of what is happening towards the end of this year, I'll start by just explaining what this opportunity is and what it could potentially mean if it has an ambitious and successful outcome. So the Convention on Biological Diversity is the overarching framework for biodiversity conservation and use globally. So it's our equivalent of the UNFCCC climate agreement, but specifically for nature, for biodiversity and all of the issues that it faces. And we're reaching a crucial moment of uplift and renewal towards the end of this year. The Conference of Parties in December in Montreal, as James has already mentioned, will be hosted by China and will agree a new global biodiversity framework and targets. And a strong global framework will be, hopefully, a guiding light for national action. Countries will need to make national plans and report on their progress towards these plans. It has the potential to galvanize finance and other commitments around it, and also raise the profile of biodiversity and encourage, hopefully, a whole of government approach to tackling the crisis. It really is a once in a decade opportunity and needs to agree some crucial things if it's to be successful. The first of these, which we've already heard a little bit about, is a nature positive global goal, so that we end the decade with more nature than we started with. We need really strong targets for species and habitats recovery. So how are we going to measure that nature positive outcome? How are we going to measure success? It will be with the kind of quality of our environment. How many species have we got? What are our ecosystems like? We also need a really strong 30 by 30 protected area target. And this needs to be about effective, equitable, and well-managed protected areas, which I think we'll probably come on to a little bit later in the discussion. It really needs to tackle the pressures and drivers of biodiversity loss as well. Otherwise, we can do all we can to save it, but if it's still being eroded at the same time, then we're fighting a losing battle. And crucially for this new framework, implementation is incredibly important. So we need the resources, we need the capacity to actually be able to implement the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So that's financing, for example, and also we need the accountability mechanisms to actually hold government to account for what they've committed to. And there is a challenge to securing this, which is what you've already alluded to. The CBD isn't necessarily the highest on the political priority list at the moment globally. So we really need to raise the profile of this moment so that failure is not an option, both kind of public and political profile. And at the moment, there's an ongoing trend, I think, that we're seeing where world leaders are signing up to ambition at the high political level. And it's really just not translating into the negotiating room. I've just come from the negotiations in Nairobi, and there really wasn't a sense of kind of urgency or pressure that really matches the urgency of the biodiversity crisis. So it really needs to translate into ambition in the negotiating room, but also ambition and action domestically at home, which James has spoken to as well. So I think that's kind of the framing of the opportunity, but also the framing of some of the problems that we have. And yeah, we've got 6 months to go. So we'll be really pushing for an ambitious outcome in December. And as James alluded to, the biodiversity crisis is everyone's problem and everyone can be part of the solutions. And this is just one of those opportunities at the end of this year. So thanks, Sean.
Thank you. A reminder to everybody that you can put your own questions in the Q&A. Georgina, I'd just like to ask from a UK perspective, I think I hear a lot of people saying that the UK government is showing great international leadership, including putting biodiversity on the agenda at COP26, at the climate COP. But delivery at home is lagging behind. A lot of targets, slow delivery, watering down of the agricultural transition, etc., etc. Is that the perception of other countries, or are they seeing UK as genuinely leading on this agenda?
Yeah, I think as I was sort of saying, there is definitely a push from the UK government to be ambitious globally. We've led on quite a few different initiatives like the Leaders Pledge for Nature, the 30 by 30 High Ambition Coalition, for example, and galvanized quite a few other countries to sign on to those as well. But I think the risk is that our credibility around kind of promoting those initiatives only goes so far if we don't take steps at home to actually implement them. I think we are getting to the point where our rhetoric isn't really turning into reality. We've been claiming global ambition for quite a few years now. Things like the 30 by 30 commitment have been around since 2019. I can't really say that I've seen an increased acceleration in kind of domestic initiatives to kind of help achieve that. So yeah, we're really moving into a point where, especially leading up to COP15, is a real opportunity for the UK, for country governments to demonstrate how they're going to implement this new global framework and make some commitments ahead of the negotiations, not wait for the negotiation outcomes, but actually go into the COP with some kind of demonstration of how they're going to implement this in an ambitious way domestically. And that will give confidence and encourage other countries to do the same. So I think, you know, our Environment Act is kind of one way we can demonstrate this. The EU has the restoration law, for example. So all of these things can be used as examples of best practice. And if they're done correctly, we should be promoting those to other governments as well, to say, look what we're doing, we're actually implementing these things domestically. But I can't say that we're quite there yet. So yeah, a little way to go, but an opportunity to do that in the next 5 to 6 months for sure.
Great, thank you. And we're also developing what could be a very ambitious target setting, set of environmental targets, so we might come on to that shortly as well. But Guy, if I can turn to you now, James gave a quite scary summary of the issues we face, the crisis we face, but also said we can turn this round, we can successfully tackle the biodiversity crisis. Do you share that optimism?
I share that we have the technical ability to achieve that. We know how to farm better. We know how to deal with the climate emergency. You know, technically, whether we have the political and business will to do it, I'm afraid I'm very much less optimistic about.
Any other reflections on James's speech?
Well, yeah, quite a few. I mean, the interlinking of climate change and biodiversity is absolutely true. I see it on the farm every day. But what I also see is the third one, is the interlinking of those two with social justice, where, you know, so much of the damage that's caused in the world, I think 50% of climate change is caused by the richest 10% of people. I mean, the two issues of loss of biodiversity and climate emergency are, you know, go hand in hand with social justice, to my mind, and the concept of there being a society at all, that we share this problem, it crosses borders, that we can't, you know, businesses exist to make money. Governments largely seem to exist, particularly at the moment, to get votes. And the action that is required is much more subtle, nuanced, and longer term than either of those institutions seem to be capable of dealing with. And that's why I guess I am a bit gloomy about turning it into action. And it's a tragedy because you know, both are very solvable problems. We know how to do it. We just don't seem to have the mechanisms for implementing those solutions. I could make
so on social justice. If I can sort of channel my inner Jacob Rees-Mogg, what he would say is what we need is cheap food. That's the way to help poorer people, and we can get cheaper food by importing loads, and don't worry too much about the pesticides, in spite of what Rachel Carson might have said. How do you respond to that sort of narrative?
Well, agriculture, producing food in this country, we produce maybe 60% of what we eat, accounts for 1.7% of GDP. It accounts for somewhere between 20 and 50%, or probably 50% of biodiversity loss, at least 20% of climate change. You know, it's ridiculous just to be focusing on the process on the price of the food. You know, when if we don't address those two problems of biodiversity loss and climate change, we are all completely damned.
Yeah, I just think the cheap food narrative is an interesting one, isn't it? That
you know, who's going to solve this problem? I mean, we've got individuals. You know, we've got business and we've got government. And I would say that, you know, the most important factor in those three by far is government. Individuals can only exert their force, you know, as voters, but as, you know, buyers of food and so on, if they're properly informed. And these issues are so complex. I've spent the last 30 years studying it and its implication for food production. I mean, James says that we should go out and only eat sustainably sourced food. Well, how the hell do you know that it's sustainably sourced? I mean, you can buy organic, but there is no other way of knowing whether your beef is pasture fed, whether your wheat is regeneratively grown. I mean, how do you know? It's a market failure. So business cannot deal with these issues, and the consumer cannot deal with them. We need government legislation. I mean, that has to be first and foremost the most important thing. And our government of just ducking it, not wanting to be nanny state, and leaving out to consumer choice is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I heard our local MP tell me that the food system was already changing through the market for regenerative agricultural produce. I mean, what a load of rubbish. There is no market for regenerative produce. Where do I go and buy it? It doesn't exist. This kind of dogma of leaving it to the marketplace is just so absurd. And Jacob Rees-Mogg represents the most extreme form of it. And we're damned while people like him are in power.
I clearly shouldn't have mentioned Jacob Rees-Mogg. Thanks, Scott. I think we'll come on back to a lot of that stuff. And I think clearly the government commissioned Henry Dimbleby to do a very thorough report on the food system, and
it was a work of genius, and they should have listened to it.
Yeah, and they've done a lot of that stuff, particularly on tackling the market failure, as you put it. Thanks very much, Guy. Let's turn to Daisy now, and I'm going to ask you more or less the same question I asked Georgina. Do you feel the optimism when you look at the negotiations internationally? Do you feel that this is high enough on government's agenda, and it's something that through the kind of UN process we can begin to turn around, as arguably we're beginning, albeit too slowly, to turn around the climate crisis? Daisy.
Thanks, Sean. I work with businesses at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development towards net zero, towards nature positive, towards making these changes. And if I was pessimistic, I couldn't do this job. Of course, there are days where I lose hope, but in the word of Christiana Figueres, who was the architect behind the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the way forward is outraged optimism. We have to be based in reality, but we have to know that it is solvable. Right? It is solvable. It is about finding the way forward. And what I'm hearing now is, failure is not an option. And that is what we're very much feeling in the negotiations. You might see articles about how frustrating it is, the pace of negotiations. And those negotiators, those are just people who are working 24/7. And sorry, I'll put on my timer. There we go, to make sure I don't overgo. Who really do an incredible job for all of our countries around the world. And thank you, Georgina, for joining us today. But it is not just about the negotiators. They cannot do it by themselves. We have to raise the profile. And that is where I find my optimism, working with business. Because we get these giant figures. We hear that nature-based solutions can draw down 1/3 of climate change, of carbon that we need. We hear from the World Economic Forum that if we are able to transition to a nature-positive economy, that's an annual business opportunity worldwide worth over $10 trillion, creates 395 billion jobs by 2030. So the good news there, besides those very shiny facts, is that tide does feel like it's changing. And if you went to COP27, which we've just heard from Georgina, is the sort of climate partner to COP15, which focuses on the biodiversity framework, there you really feel the optimism. The narrative is changing. Nature is becoming embedded in those arguments. And maybe we're not yet seeing that in the biodiversity framework sort of alternative. Saying that, we do have a lot of ambition by companies, with 1,100 companies who hold revenues of over $5 trillion US. They're advocating specifically for nature positive. So I would disagree a little bit respectfully with Guy there, in that I do think companies have a big role to play, but they can only do it in collaboration with government. So there I very much stand by his opinion as well. Now, I'm not like a blind optimist. The challenges for getting to that nature positive, nature-based solutions filled world that we've just heard about in some lovely prose, the challenges are huge. We have so much more work to do. We don't have time to lose hope. We don't have time to stop. And a big issue there is that voices are not being listened to. We heard a bit from Guy, linking to farmers and the people who are actually feeding us, but also in terms of local community, indigenous peoples. There's also a mismatch in ambition. We have these businesses saying nature positive in renewable energy, all these ambitions, all this finance being committed, when really the actual actions on the ground are still quite small scale. It is changing, and that gives me hope. But linking those two is a very complicated framework. Now, where I work is in a little niche where climate and nature comes together, and it's getting bigger and bigger. And so I wanted, there's a quote actually from our guidance for COP15, which is that without achieving a nature positive role by 2030, we cannot achieve net zero by 2050 and meet the Paris climate change agreements. So the biggest risk is to address COP15 and COP27 as not related at all. And the biggest opportunity is actually to address them together. And so I love the, talking about a spring without voices. I think we have a lot of voices in this space. We need to make sure we're listening to the right ones. We need to make sure we're making the right claims. When Guy says regenerative agriculture, he's absolutely right. How do you know what you're buying, what you're investing in, what you're voting for is actually working towards that nature positive goal? And that is firmly embedded, that responsibility, in companies and in government, and them working together ideally on regulations. Another thing that was absolutely, you'll hear again that the negotiations are frustratingly slow, and it's really difficult. But a great note on the side of business is globally we've seen more ambition from the business side, but also more conversation within those negotiations, the two that have happened already. Specifically, we've seen an ambition in greater recognition for disclosure and disclosure requirements around climate and biodiversity. And we've seen a real emphasis on financial flows and getting them to the right people. And I think I'll stop with that. I would just say that I think optimism is absolutely necessary. It just needs to be grounded in some very, very harsh reality, which I think this recent report really gives us. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Daisy. Just a reminder to everybody: put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat. You can use the chat, but it's not being monitored. And to please feel free to tweet at #GA event. So, Daisy, if I just ask you talked about the interrelationship between the climate COP and the CBD COP. Is it unhelpful now that you've got these two processes running side by side? Should we be thinking about having one single COP?
That is a fabulous question, and I think the negotiators would tear their hair out at the idea of combining these two into the same COP. There is a lot of expertise between both, and there are some specific areas between both. I definitely think looking more at the linkages between the two and having something that bridges that gap would be ideal. I mean, we're not going to have a single COP anytime soon at the pace that these things happen. But one clear way forward is I think COP15 can learn from COP27. What Georgina's saying, what I've seen the questions and answers, how do we get the sort of momentum that we see behind COP27, outrage as well as optimism? It's not all positive, but how do we get that interest? Those global leaders, CEOs are at COP27. Why are those CEOs, why are those global leaders not at COP15? And I think by learning from COP27 and also by bringing in the climate angle, which nature-based solutions can, because nature-based solutions are at their heart, talking about biodiversity net gains, social net gains, and then also some societal challenge, which can be climate. And so nature-based solutions, I believe, is the way to bring that sort of furor, that buy-in from COP27 over into COP15.
Great, thank you. So if the panelists can all turn your cameras on, we'll have a bit of a discussion on some of that now, and do feel free to sort of butt in and engage with each other. But James, I'm going to turn to you first on Guy's challenge about market failure I guess also the fact that really in the end only the state can direct the solutions. Does the state do enough? Does it fund you enough to do what you've got to do?
I think we're all clear that there's a vital role for governments, there's a vital role for business, for NGOs, and for each of us as members of the public. And we won't solve these interlinked crises without all of those people playing their full role. I'm not as I really kind of liked the energy with which Guy was denouncing various actors on this stage, and I think we should feel angry about the situation, but we need to turn that anger into useful energy that gets stuff done. I think governments do respond to pressure from voters, from the media. And so the first thing we need to do is make sure that all governments, not just our own, feel that pressure and feel that demand from their own publics. I think business is responding. I agree very much with what Daisy said there. Businesses ultimately want to survive, thrive, and make money. And just as in the climate world, so too in the biodiversity world, increasing numbers of businesses are recognizing that they won't be able to survive and thrive unless they themselves address the biodiversity crisis. And one of the main drivers in that is that their customers are starting to want them to address the biodiversity crisis, and they are asking, is this sustainable? Where is this sourced from? How can I be sure that when I buy this product, I am not trashing the environment? And that silent pressure is building up on businesses to make the difference that they need to do. So, all of those actors need to act. All of them need to act in interlinked ways. Governments do need to give a lead. I think the UK government's done pretty well, but like every other government, we can always do more.
Can I come in on that? Governments, businesses want to act because their customers want them to act. Governments want to act because their voters want them to act. Well, it's not true. I mean, governments want to be seen to act and make bold, as I think, was it Georgina said, they're all about, their aspirations and very poor on the delivery. And businesses are just the same. They want to be seen to be green, but they just can't be bothered to take the long-term action. And because it's expensive, it's incredibly complex, and anything that's complex is hard to communicate and incorporate into a brand. So it just doesn't work without really good information, really well-educated and informed consumers, which is a really strong ask given the complexities of this issues. I mean, what is regenerative farming? I mean, even farmers can't agree on it. So how on earth can you expect food buyers to be making those decisions? I'm sorry, it's absurd, and it's ducking the issue. This lands fairly and squarely, with government to lay out the framework from which businesses can work within. I share the optimism in that there are a huge majority of people who are prepared to make the very marginal sacrifices that are required to solve these two problems. The problem is linking that up with business, and without a sort of government framework, it's just not going to happen. And we can be as optimistic as we like, but if we carry on behaving as our government behaves, and as the main next prime ministers are all advocating, cutting taxes and slashing legislation, we are all doomed. And we all need to stand up and damn well say that, including people working within NGOs and government institutions, even if it costs them their job.
Guy, do you not see any progress in recent years?
No, I don't. I despair of the agricultural policy, which is rapidly being rewound, the elms and so on the basis of some right-wing Tory voting farmers, who want to see a free market where they can produce as much as possible. And, there are a lot of farmers who really do care about the environment and, really want to be part of the solution, but they need a framework in which they can operate. I mean, the very least is clear labelling and enforcement through a food standards agency and the trading standards, which there's no one there. They've all been defunded. There is no one there to enforce anything. You can say whatever you like about a product now, because there's no one there to stand up and you know, make sure that you're being truthful. And indeed, we've had a leader who doesn't give a damn about the truth, so why should anyone else?
So James, I'll ask you to come back on that in a minute, but Daisy, would the businesses you work with, who presumably regard themselves as kind of progressive businesses, would they welcome more central direction, so that there was a level playing field and they could go further?
I'm really glad you asked that. It was one of the biggest, you know, I used to work in the international governmental organization world with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And one of my biggest surprises working with these businesses is that most of them do welcome more regulation. They welcome regulation on biodiversity. They welcome the idea of you know, there was an EU regulation on products that have nothing to do with forestation. So no products will be able to be sold that have any link to deforestation. They welcome that ambition, and it helps them, you know, set up their own frameworks, like we've just heard from Guy. One of the problems and one of the challenges that businesses are facing on a global scale, and I imagine it sounds like very much also on a national scale, is they want to be part of those conversations to make sure they're feasible to follow. So even that conversation that the EU is having about this deforestation-free products, big businesses are saying, that's great, we want that. But if you do it without asking us how we can do it, you're going to come up with this regulation that we just cannot enact. It's just not even feasible within our own data and our own way of working. And so we need to be part of those conversations. And of course, that's a controversial sort of area because it speaks to lobbying, it speaks to business having a say more in government. So it's not an easy path forward. And that's actually where the WBCSD, where we step in to represent businesses in the link to things like COP15 and also at various national levels. So they absolutely welcome more of that regulation, more of that governmental conversations, but they want it to be a two-way conversation at the same time and not this sort of top-down approach.
Okay, thanks. James, I don't think you can respond to everything Guy said, but just specifically on farming reform, is he right? Is this all going the wrong way?
Well, I mean, sure. I mean, firstly, Guy's right, we need to beware greenwashing, right? And there's a lot of it about, so let's just be clear about that. But most of the politicians that I've met, and I've spent 40 years with politicians of all stripes, they're like us. They mostly want to make the world a better place. You know, it's not a very, you know, it's a pretty thankless task being a jobbing politician. And of course, you know, Guy's right that there are people in all walks of life, as in politics, who are cynical. But my experience of most politicians is that they actually do want to do the right thing. I think the challenge for us is to help them do the right thing. I would say that government of all political colours has actually given pretty good leads in this country over the last couple of decades. The Climate Change Act, which was a Labour act, first time a major industrialised economy had introduced measures by law that would affect the economy. That's really given a great framework for industry and business, and it started to bring down our emissions. Net zero by 2050, target adopted by the previous Conservative government, another example from a cross-party of supporting the right thing. And, you know, on agriculture, you know, I think that the policy that this government is on, which is essentially paying public money to deliver public goods like better environmental outcomes, is a far better strategy than the common agricultural policy, which is essentially paying farmers to farm and not really doing very much about the environment other than damaging it. It's not finally formed. There are still details that need to be worked out. But I think the best way for us to proceed, both on that farming strategy and on all the other issues, is to engage with the government of the day in order to influence it. I think we'll get further there than by just sort of denouncing it. Thank you.
Thanks. I want to come to questions, but super brief, Daisy. You've got a one-sentence response on that.
So just to go even further, I think what we're also talking about here is not just us doing these sort of societies doing the work, or just the UK doing the work and what we can learn from the UK, but also who the UK can learn from. And that's the same with government and business. So I wanted to say there's also a big part of business that knows we need to do this faster and we don't need to wait for the regulations. We're just going ahead. We've got our science-based targets networks. We have the frameworks available. We've got accountability frameworks, task force for nature-related financial disclosures. Not the majority of business, but a good amount of business is going beyond because they can move faster than government. And that's the same, I think, that we see in the negotiations. It's not just about who is leading the way, it's about learning from each other. What can government learn from business? What can the UK learn from other countries in those negotiations, and vice versa? Like what Georgina said, learning from the restoration side of things. We don't have time to say only they have the right solution, only government, only business. No, no, no. Who's got the best solution? Let's follow that. Let's learn together. And that's the same in the negotiations for COP15.
Okay, thanks, Daisy. Sarah, questions from the audience?
I'm going to group a few together around sort of the role of public education / communication. So basically, are we doing enough to make sure people are aware of the crisis and action that should be taken? What more needs to be done? And specifically, what can we do to raise the importance of COP15 in the same way that sort of COP26 caught the public's attention?
Thanks. I'm going to go to Georgina first. Are we doing enough? Is there enough leadership? I'd say I'm sort of beginning to feel, when I look at the Conservative leadership race, I'm feeling prematurely nostalgic for Boris Johnson, who has championed this agenda. Georgina, you respond to
No,
Sarah.
I think it's a fair challenge. I mean, the biodiversity crisis doesn't get the level of attention it needs in terms of the scale of the challenge and the potential impacts, I think. But then again, the climate crisis didn't until pretty recently, really, until 2015 and Copenhagen in the year before that, when that was a crushing disappointment for many. So I think it's really only in the last 15 years that we've seen a gradual increase in the attention on climate, and only really recently the kind of attention that it's needed. There's still a huge amount to do, and biodiversity is incredibly behind that. So I think we've been talking a bit, we've been hearing about government, business, individuals, society, etc. And I think it's the role of everybody to shout loudly about this, to put our cards on the table and to say that COP15 could deliver a Paris Agreement for nature, and to really promote that. So the ambitious businesses that Daisy is working with, get behind it, talk about it, shout about it. When they're talking to governments, say that this is an important event, say why. The same for civil society organizations. Let's communicate about COP15, why it's important, why it matters, why people should care about it. I mean, the RSPB will be hopefully running a public facing campaign in the lead up to COP15, but I don't see a lot of other organizations doing that. So actually let's put our cards behind it. Let's back it as an ambitious moment for nature and communicate why that's important to people. And I think the climate community has done quite a good job of, still a little bit further to go, but in communicating why climate change has an impact on individuals, why it has an impact on the various aspects of people's lives. And I think that's a really important thing for us as the biodiversity community as well, to begin to explain why the biodiversity crisis has an impact on individuals, why it has an impact on our society as a whole as well. So really making those personal connections to people's health, to people's environment, to the nature they see on their doorstep every day is incredibly important.
Thanks. Guy, if I can just ask you, I imagine most Riverford customers were engaged in some way with COP26. Does COP15 resonate at all, or is it just a kind of huge international jamboree thousands of miles away? You're muted.
Sorry. As far as I'm aware, no, it doesn't resonate at all. Sorry, something's put. It doesn't resonate at all. And why should it? I mean, the Glasgow COP, we got to the final day until fossil fuels were mentioned, which are 89% of the driving of climate change, the final day. And then we couldn't even agree on anything. Why should anyone, why should we get informed about something which is just drivel? I'm sorry, but I mean, we've got to address in terms of climate change, we've got to address the main issue, which is the burning of fossil fuels. Yet through, the lobbying, and ideally hope that none of Daisy's members are part of this process, that have managed to keep it off the agenda. It's like something out of Monty Python's. I mean, it's just, we are participating in a farce, and we need to call it out as a farce. It's ridiculous. We've got to start burning less fossil fuels. The idea that we're going to, tax fossil fuel companies less so that they have money to invest in green energy is just ridiculous. I mean, all the evidence is that they'll invest it in funding climate change denial. You know, so the idea that capitalism, you know, works in that way is just completely absurd. Sorry, I'm ranting again. No, I don't think COP15. I'm sorry. I mean, I do really appreciate the people who work behind the scenes to make these things work. And it's all very well for me to be angry and start damning. I mean, I do have my own solutions, you know, at a farm level. And I do think it's incredibly important that these conferences, you know, do set a framework. But I do think we need to have some honesty about, you know, someone was saying that there'll be CEOs at COP27. Well, I bloody well wish they weren't. You know, then we might discuss fossil fuels. And if they didn't arrive in private jets, all the better.
We'll get, Guy, I'll ask Georgina to write a couple of optimistic sentences for your newsletter. Georgina, quickly, and then we'll go back to Sarah for another thing, and I'll let James come in.
Just super quickly, I think it's a really fair challenge, and I think one of the themes that we're definitely picking up from panelists' response is that these are all part of a solution. No one thing is going to provide the kind of silver bullet that's going to solve everything. So I think global agreements have their place. I think individual action has its place. I think business action has its place, and we see that as a kind of collective movement towards a shared aim. So I can see the challenge, and I think we should be working as hard as possible to make these global agreements deliver what they can and what they have the potential to. You know, they are a framework that we can hold governments to account for, that we can increase pressure on. We can use the commitments that were made at Paris to kind of hold governments to account for what they're not doing, rightly so. So I think everything has its place, and I think it's part of a bigger puzzle, and we should see it as a collective picture of action, and we should work to make each bit of that work as hard as possible, because it's a huge challenge.
Thanks, Georgina. Someone's put in the chat, Guy for PM, and there is still time to stand, I think, to get your 20 votes. Sarah, another question.
Yeah, well, following on from that sort of reflections about what other tools there are in the toolbox, wanted to ask a question about the role of enforcement, particularly in relation to issues such as England's polluted waterways, and suggestion that this needs more focus and funding over some of the other options that have been discussed thus far.
Guy's cheering, but it sounds like one for James. James, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I will. Can I maybe come back to Guy, because I completely respect the passion with which he's spoken, but in the interest of sort of a good debate, I don't think you can have it both ways, Guy. I don't think you can say, as we all do, that there needs to be, because we have a global problem with biodiversity and climate, there has to be a global solution. We all agree about that. And you've rightly said there's a fantastically important role for governments, and we all agree about that. And what COP15 and COP27 and all the other international fora are world governments coming together to try and tackle those problems. And we can't, I think if we have to have that mechanism, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for solving the problem. And we need to understand.
I do completely acknowledge that and somewhat apologize.
And we need to understand, to your point, Guy, about carbon and coal, we need to understand why countries like India and China come to those conferences and they're not prepared to make the changes that we want them to make. And the basic answer is because their people at the moment depend on the energy that coal is producing. So there's a big onus on us as other members of the international community, both to make the arguments about why that needs to change and to support those governments and those countries to get off those high carbon ways of generating energy. So I wouldn't sort of junk the process. I would want to support it and make it better. On the question about regulation, you know, what we know in this country and elsewhere is that where you have robust regulatory frameworks accompanied by the necessary resources to give effect to them, you get very impressive results. And over the last 30 years, the actual story of our rivers is that by and large, the water quality in those rivers have improved very substantially. There's still more to do. There are still some things that are not where they need to be, and there are some things that are going backwards. But the main reason for those improvements, which we can see in all sorts of ways, not just in terms of measuring the chemicals, but in the wildlife returning to some of those rivers, is to do with regulation that the Environment Agency has led. So, you know, my take is let's make sure that we retain and where possible improve regulation. Let's make it robust. Let's make it outcome focused, and let's make sure it's properly resourced so that we and the other regulators can deliver the outcomes that we all want.
And is the main reason the waters aren't as clean as they should be under regulation? Because obviously there's a big attack on regulation.
The main reason waters aren't where they need to be is a combination of poor performance by water and sewage companies, which we will be calling out in a report that we will be issuing on Thursday. Watch out for that. Is massive amounts of diffuse pollution from farming, which contributes just as much to damaging our waters as the water company, and due to runoff from road, tarmac, etc. in cities. So there's a complex list of problems. We need to tackle all of them if we're going to improve matters. And as I say, I think the onus is on, making sure that the regulatory framework is right. But let's remember, the people who are responsible for the pollution in our rivers are the people who pollute them. And we need to make sure that our focus is on them and making sure that they do the right thing.
Thanks. Sarah, super quick last question.
Yeah, so the top most voted one report highlights the effects of consumption in wealthy countries and the impact that has on biodiversity and habitats overseas. So what role do government agencies have in sort of driving the transition in consumption practices and sort of addressing overseas impacts of consumption?
Guy.
Be pretty good if we honoured the promises that we'd made to support those countries in the first place. Is it 100 billion or something that hasn't been delivered? Promises that are made, delivery very poor. So I would say just starting off by honouring our promises would be a good start.
Great, thanks. Anybody else got a really quick response to that? Georgina, and then I'm going to go to one last question to all of you.
Yeah, to speak to kind of current processes that are happening at the moment, the UK is in the process of developing a due diligence obligation, which is basically looking at deforestation risk in supply chains. And at the moment, it's shaping up to be considerably weaker than the European and the United States regulations on due diligence. So again, another process where we're kind of claiming global leadership, but at the moment it looks like it's shaping up to not be as ambitious as it could be. So that's very much a kind of policy solution. It's not necessarily a kind of wider consumer solution, but it's something to watch out for.
Thanks, Georgina. So Daisy, your 15-second pitch to the new Prime Minister when we have one.
I'm going to go with what you said, which is COP15 make it the spectacle that COP27 is. That is where you can stand above other leaders in making it have the same ambition and same scale.
Great, Georgina.
Yeah, and I think echoing what Daisy says, and to take a slightly different turn your rhetoric into reality, basically.
Turn your rhetoric. Great, thank you. Guy, and it can't be you lying bastard. What's it going to be?
No, I like Georgina's turn your rhetoric into reality. I'll second that.
Brilliant. James, last word. What are you going to say to the PM? You'll probably actually meet the new PM.
I would quote, I wouldn't tell them where I've got this from, because this was, I saw this a poster in an Extinction Rebellion demo, but I would quote what it said on that poster, which was, the biggest threat to the planet is the belief that someone else will save it. And I would say to the new Prime Minister, we have agency, so let's use it.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Great note on which to end. Thanks very much indeed to James. Thanks, Georgina, Daisy, Guy. Really interesting debate. Do carry it on the Twitter, #GA debate. And I'd like to thank the audience very much indeed as well. Thanks all, and have a great day.